The diner smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, and Maren Voss had exactly $4.30 in her coat pocket when she sat down across from her daughter and lied to her for the third time that week. "I already ate at work," she said. 6-year-old Delphine didn't look up from the crayon drawing she was making on the paper placemat. "You always say that. Because it's always true, baby." It wasn't true. It hadn't been true since Tuesday. Maren pushed the small plate of pancakes toward her daughter and watched her eat like it was the only thing in the world that mattered, because right now it was. Outside the window, the November wind was doing that thing where it rattled the glass just enough to remind you winter wasn't asking permission this year. She'd worked a double at the hospital laundry facility, 16 hours folding sheets that other people would sleep on while she drove home in a car that made a sound like a dying animal every time she braked. Her ex-husband, Colton, hadn't sent a support payment in 5 months. The last time she'd called him about it, he'd told her that maybe if she'd kept the family together, she wouldn't need his money so bad. She hadn't cried on that call. She'd learned not to cry where anyone could hear her. In the booth behind her, a man in a gray wool coat sat alone with a coffee he wasn't drinking and a laptop he wasn't looking at. He'd been there when they walked in. He'd be there, Maren guessed, whether they stayed or not. The kind of man who looked like he came to diners to be somewhere that wasn't an office and somewhere that wasn't home either. She didn't notice him. Why would she? People like her had stopped noticing anyone who wasn't directly in front of them, because there was no room left for anything that didn't need solving in the next 10 minutes. Delphine finished the last bite of pancake and looked up. "Mommy, are you sad?" "No, sweetheart. You get the face." "What face?" "The one where you smile but your eyes don't." Maren laughed, because if she didn't laugh she was going to do the other thing, and she reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "I'm just tired. Grown-up tired. It goes away." "Does it?" And there was the question a 6-year-old shouldn't have to ask, and the one Maren didn't have an honest answer for. She thought about the eviction notice folded into fourths in her glove box. She thought about the widening gap between what she made and what rent cost, a gap that had started as a crack 2 years ago and had become something she fell into every single month now. She thought about how 3 days from now, on the 1st of December, her landlord was going to knock on the door of the apartment where her daughter kept her stuffed rabbit on the windowsill so it could see the moon, and tell her that if she didn't have the balance she needed to be out by the 15th. She looked down at the check on the table. $6 and change. She had $4.30. She could feel her face doing the thing it did right before panic. A tightness behind the eyes, a stall in the breath, and she pressed her palm flat against the formica like it could hold her still. "I'll be right back," she told Delphine. Bathroom. She wasn't going to the bathroom. She stood at the counter near the register, waiting for the waitress to finish with another table, and she let herself say it. Not loud. Barely even a whisper. The kind of sentence you only let out when you think no one is close enough to catch it. "Single moms don't get happy endings." He said it to no one. She said it to the napkin dispenser, to the smudged glass case of pies nobody had touched since lunch, to the tired version of herself reflected in the window behind the counter. She didn't know the man in the gray coat had gotten up from his booth 30 seconds earlier to refill his coffee, and that he was standing exactly 4 feet behind her when she said it. He went still. Maren didn't notice. She was already counting coins in her palm, doing math that never worked out right no matter how many times she ran it. "Excuse me," the man said. She turned, startled, embarrassed in the specific way that only people who are barely holding on can be embarrassed, like being caught in the middle of drowning. "I wasn't talking to you," she said quickly. "Sorry. I didn't mean to, sorry." "I know," he said. "I heard you anyway." She looked at him properly for the first time. Late 30s, maybe 40. Tired eyes that didn't match the expensive coat. A wedding ring he wasn't wearing, but you could tell by the pale line on his finger that he used to. "I'm fine," Maren said, the automatic response of every woman who has learned that admitting otherwise costs more than it's worth. "You don't have to be," he said. "But for what it's worth, that sentence you just said. It's not true. You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "I don't. But I know that sentence. My mother used to say something like it right before she stopped believing anything good could happen to her." And I spent a long time wishing somebody had told her she was wrong before she convinced herself of it completely. Maren didn't know what to do with that. Strangers weren't supposed to say things like this. Strangers in diners were supposed to look past you the way everyone else did. I have to get back to my daughter, she said and walked away before he could answer. He didn't look back. She didn't see him sit back down slowly, staring at the space where she'd been standing, his coffee forgotten, something working behind his eyes that looked a lot like a decision being made. His name was Adrian Cole, and 3 weeks earlier his company had laid off 400 people from a distribution center 40 miles outside the city. A decision he'd approved from a conference room with a view, based on a spreadsheet that didn't have names on it, only numbers with dollar signs. He hadn't thought about what those 400 people looked like at their kitchen tables that night. He was thinking about it now. Adrian Cole ran Halden Logistics, a supply chain company his father had built from 3 trucks and a warehouse in 1987, and which Adrian had grown into something with 40 distribution hubs and 11,000 employees. On paper, Adrian Cole was a success story. In reality, he was a man who had spent the last 2 years since his divorce eating dinner alone in diners because the silence of his own apartment had started to feel like an accusation. He watched Maren walk back to her booth, watched her sit across from her daughter and pull the little girl's coat sleeve straight without even seeming to think about it. The automatic tenderness of someone who loved harder than her circumstances deserved. He didn't approach again. Not that night. But he asked the waitress on his way out who that woman was. Maren, the waitress said. Comes in maybe once a week, always orders for the kid, never for herself. Tries to hide it. We stopped charging her for coffee refills a while back. Don't tell her I told you that. Adrian nodded, paid his check and left a $100 bill folded under his saucer with instructions to put it toward Maren's next several visits, no matter how she protested. He didn't do it because he wanted credit. He didn't even leave his name. He did it because for the first time in longer than he could remember, something in him had stopped being numb. Maren found out about the coffee 3 visits later, when the waitress finally cracked and told her, and it made her angrier than grateful, which confused her more than either feeling on its own. I don't need charity, she said. It's not charity, it's a paid tab, the waitress said. The guy insisted on staying anonymous. Sorry, hon, I probably shouldn't have said anything. Maren thought about the man in the gray coat. She hadn't seen him again. Part of her, the tired, defensive part that had learned the hard way that kindness usually had a hook buried in it somewhere, was relieved he hadn't come back. The other part, the part she didn't examine too closely, kept glancing at the booth by the window every time the door chimed. She didn't see him again for 11 days. In those 11 days, everything got worse. The eviction notice stopped being a piece of paper folded in her glove box and became a phone call from her landlord, a man named Roy Anders who managed 6 buildings in the neighborhood and had the specific talent of sounding both apologetic and immovable in the same sentence. I like you, Maren. I like your kid. But I've got a mortgage on that building same as you've got rent on that apartment and I can't carry you another month. You're at $1,400 behind now. If I don't see something by the 15th, I have to start the process. The process meant a sheriff's notice taped to her door. It meant Delphine watching strangers carry their things to the curb. It meant calling her sister in Ohio who had 3 kids of her own and a husband who'd made it clear more than once that Maren's problems weren't his. She hung up the phone in the break room at the hospital laundry facility and sat on an overturned bucket and put her head in her hands, and for exactly 90 seconds she let herself fall apart completely, because she couldn't afford to do it anywhere Delphine could see. Then she wiped her face, clocked back in and folded sheets for 6 more hours. The second time Adrian Cole and Maren Voss spoke, it wasn't in the diner. It was in the parking lot of Delphine's elementary school on a Tuesday afternoon, and it happened because of the kind of coincidence that feels engineered by something bigger than luck, even when it isn't. Adrian's company, it turned out, was in early conversations to acquire a small regional laundry and linen service, the very one that supplied contracts to St. Agatha's Hospital where Maren worked. He'd come to walk the facility that morning with 2 vice presidents and a due diligence folder an inch thick, and afterward, restless and unable to face another empty dinner, he'd driven without any particular destination and found himself outside a school just as the afternoon bell rang. He recognized her immediately. The woman from the diner standing at the edge of the pickup line in a coat that had seen better winters, scanning the doors for her daughter's face the way you'd scan a crowd for the one person keeping you upright. He almost didn't say anything. He told himself later that he almost drove away. But Delphine came barreling out the doors first and she was crying. Not the ordinary crying of a 6-year-old who'd had a bad day. The kind of crying that makes every adult within 30 feet stop what they're doing. Maren dropped to her knees before the girl even reached her. "Baby, what happened?" "Tanner said we're gonna be homeless," Delphine sobbed. "He said his mom said we're getting kicked out and everybody at school knows and they said I'm poor and..." Maren pulled her daughter against her chest and over the top of Delphine's head for one unguarded second. Her face did something Adrian recognized instantly, because he'd seen it on his own mother's face 26 years ago in a kitchen that smelled like burnt toast and unpaid bills. It was the face of someone realizing the walls were closing faster than she could build a way out. Adrian didn't think. He walked over. "Excuse me," he said again, the same 2 words from the diner, and Maren looked up, startled, mortified all over again to be seen like this. On her knees in a parking lot, holding a sobbing child, everything she'd been hiding suddenly visible to a stranger in an expensive coat. "I'm not. This isn't." She stood, pulling Delphine against her hip. "This is a private moment. Please." "I know," Adrian said. "I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to intrude." He hesitated and something in his hesitation made Maren pause instead of walking away. "You said something to me a couple weeks ago. In the diner. About single mothers and happy endings." Maren's face went cold. "You're the coffee." "I'm the coffee," he admitted. "I told the waitress I don't need." "I know what you told her." His voice was quiet, steady, none of the performative sympathy she'd learned to distrust from people who wanted to feel good about themselves more than they wanted to actually help. "I'm not here to make you feel like a charity case. I'm here because I own a company that's in the process of acquiring the laundry service you work for, and in about 6 weeks I'm going to be, whether either of us likes it or not, connected to your paycheck." Maren blinked. "You're what?" "Halden Logistics. We're acquiring Crestline Linen Services." He watched the information land, watched her calculate what it might mean, watched her brace for the worst the way people who've been failed by systems always brace. "I'm not telling you that to threaten your job. I'm telling you because it means I'm going to be walking through that facility again in a few weeks. And I didn't want the first time you found out who I was to be an accident in a hallway. Why does it matter what I think of you?" The question hung there and Adrian realized with something like surprise that he didn't have a fast answer. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But it does." Delphine, still sniffling, peeked out from against her mother's coat. "Are you the coffee man?" Adrian crouched down to her level, the way you do for kids without thinking about it if you've ever actually loved one. "I guess I am." "Tanner's wrong," Delphine said with sudden, fierce conviction. "We're not gonna be homeless. My mom always figures it out." Maren's eyes filled fast and she looked away toward the school building like she could will the tears back in through sheer force of will. Adrian stood. "I have a business proposal," he said. "Not charity. A job. My company's expanding its facilities division and we need someone who understands laundry logistics from the floor up, not from a spreadsheet. Better pay, benefits, daycare stipend. I'm not offering it because of what I overheard in a diner. I'm offering it because Crestline's site manager told me this morning, unprompted, that you're the most reliable employee they have and they'd hate to lose you in the transition." It wasn't entirely true. The site manager had said something close to it, but Adrian had asked the question specifically because he'd already been thinking about her. He told himself the job offer was legitimate on its own merits. He mostly believed it. Maren stared at him for a long moment. The wariness in her face wasn't fading, but something else was moving underneath it. "I need to think about it," she said. "Take the week," Adrian said. "Here's my card. Call the number on the back. That's my assistant, not me. She'll set up an interview whenever you're ready. No pressure. No strings." Maren took the card like it might be hot to the touch. She didn't tell him about the eviction. She didn't tell him about the 15th. Some pride, some deeply worn instinct not to let anyone see the whole picture at once, kept her from saying it. She'd find out later that not telling him almost cost her everything. The interview happened 4 days later, and it went well enough that Maren left the building with an offer letter in her bag and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The new job started in 3 weeks. Higher pay, real benefits, a daycare subsidy that would cover Delphine's after-school program. 3 weeks. The eviction deadline was in 5 days. Maren did the math over and over that night at her kitchen table, the offer letter next to a stack of bills, like maybe if she stared at the numbers hard enough they'd rearrange themselves into something survivable. They didn't. The new paycheck, no matter how good, wasn't going to land in her account in time to save the apartment she was in right now. She called her landlord. "Roy, I got a new job. Better pay. I start in 3 weeks. "Congratulations," Roy said, and he sounded like he meant it, which somehow made it worse. "But Maren, I already told the Kowalskis they could have the unit if you didn't come through by the 15th. They've got the deposit ready. I can't hold it any longer. I'm sorry. I really am." She hung up and sat in the dark for a long time. He thought about calling Adrian Cole. His card was still in her bag. She'd looked at it a dozen times over the last 4 days, turned it over in her fingers like it was a decision she hadn't made yet. She didn't call. Not because she didn't want to. Because some wound deeper than pride told her that if she called a wealthy stranger every time her life fell apart, she'd stop being a person who solved her own problems and start being a person who waited to be rescued. And she'd watched that happen to women before, watched them lose themselves in the debt of being saved, and she wasn't going to let it happen to her. So she did what she always did. She got up the next morning and she solved it herself, badly the only way available to her. She packed what she could into the trunk of her dying car, put the rest in storage using the last of her savings, and told Delphine they were going to stay somewhere new for a little while like it was an adventure. Delphine, 6 years old and sharper than anyone gave her credit for, looked at her mother in the rearview mirror and said, "Is this the homeless Tanner was talking about?" Maren gripped the wheel. "No, baby. This is temporary. Everything's temporary." They stayed the first 2 nights in the car in a 24-hour grocery store parking lot, because it was well lit and Maren felt safer there than anywhere quieter. He told Delphine it was camping. Delphine, exhausted, didn't argue. On the 3rd day, Maren went to work at the hospital laundry facility like nothing had happened, because if she stopped moving even for a second, she was afraid she wouldn't start again. That was the day Adrian Cole walked through the facility on his scheduled acquisition tour and saw her name missing from the shift roster he'd specifically asked to review. She'd been marked current employee transitioning, and out of nothing more than the small habit he'd developed of noticing her, asked where she was. The site manager shrugged. "Should be on the floor. Let me check." He found her in the break room. Not on a break. Asleep, upright in a plastic chair, still in her work uniform, dark circles carved so deep under her eyes that for a second he didn't recognize her. "Maren." She startled awake, disoriented, and for a moment her face was completely unguarded, raw, frightened, the face of someone who has been running on empty for 3 days and has just been caught with nothing left to hide behind. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, standing too fast, swaying slightly. "I wasn't sleeping on the clock, I was on my break, Maren, sit down." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Sit down." She sat because her legs weren't entirely convinced they could hold her up anyway. Adrian pulled the other plastic chair around and sat across from her, close, the way you sit when you've decided the professional distance doesn't matter anymore. "What happened?" he asked. She almost lied. The lie was right there, loaded and ready, the same one she'd been telling for weeks. "I'm fine. Just tired." Goes away. But something about the exhaustion or the fact that he'd found her asleep upright in a chair with nowhere else to be, cracked the wall she'd built. "We lost the apartment," she said quietly. 4 days ago. I've been staying in my car with my daughter." Adrian went very still. "Why didn't you call me?" "Because I don't want to be somebody's project," Maren said, and her voice shook, but it didn't break. "I don't want to be the sad story you tell at dinner parties about the time you saved the poor single mom. I've spent my whole life being underestimated by people who thought they were being generous. I would rather sleep in my car than owe somebody something I can't pay back. Adrian sat with that for a long moment. You wouldn't owe me anything, he said finally. But I understand why you don't believe that. I'm not going to pretend I know what it's like to be you. I don't. I've never had to choose between rent and food in my life, and I'm not going to insult you by acting like I have. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. But I do know what it's like to watch someone you love disappear into exhaustion because nobody stepped in soon enough. And I already stepped away once. That day I gave you my card and walked off feeling good about myself, when I should have asked more questions. That's on me. Not you. Maren looked at him, wary, exhausted, and something in her resolve, the resolve that had kept her upright through 3 nights in a parking lot, finally gave a fraction of an inch. Where's Delphine right now? Adrian asked. School. I have to pick her up in 2 hours. Okay. Adrian stood. Here's what's going to happen and you can say no to any of it. There's a corporate short-stay apartment my company keeps for relocating executives. It's sitting empty right now. 2 bedrooms, fully furnished, paid through the company, no cost to you for as long as you need it while you get back on your feet. You don't owe me anything for it. It's not coming out of your pocket or your pride. It's coming out of a line item that already exists whether you use it or not. Adrian, I can't. You can say no, he said again. But I'm asking you to think about Delphine before you do. Not about what you can prove to yourself. About her tonight in a car. That landed harder than anything else he could have said. Maren looked down at her hands, cracked and raw the same way Adrian remembered noticing on someone else once. A memory he didn't share with her yet. Okay, she whispered. Hey. For Delphine. The apartment had 2 bedrooms and heat that worked and a kitchen with actual food in the fridge, because Adrian's assistant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya, had stocked it that same afternoon without being asked twice. Delphine ran through the rooms like she'd been let loose in a museum, and that night for the first time in 4 days, Maren slept 8 uninterrupted hours and woke up crying, not from sadness, but from the strange, disorienting relief of not being afraid for one single night. She started the new job 2.5 weeks later. She was good at it, better than good. Within 2 months she'd been promoted to shift coordinator. Within 4 months to floor operations lead. Adrian noticed and made himself notice from a professional distance because whatever was growing between them he refused to let it look like something built on power or rescue. He wanted her to earn every inch of it because he suspected, correctly, that anything less would break the fragile trust she'd only just begun extending to him. They didn't fall into a relationship easily or fast. There were dinners that were just dinners. There were months where Maren kept him at careful arm's length, still braced for the hook she was sure was somewhere in all this kindness. There was a night 5 months in when she finally asked him directly why he'd never once tried to make this into something it wasn't. Because you told me you didn't want to owe anyone anything, Adrian said. And I decided the only way I was ever going to be someone you chose instead of someone you settled for out of gratitude, was to wait until there was nothing left for you to owe me. It took another 3 months after that for Maren to admit out loud, to herself before she admitted it to him, that what she felt wasn't gratitude anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. But the story doesn't end there because stories like this one never resolve as cleanly as the beginning promises, and 6 months into the new life Maren had built. Steady job, steady apartment now paid for on her own, Delphine thriving, a relationship with Adrian that had become something real and unhurried. Colton came back. He showed up at Delphine's school again, this time in person, claiming he wanted to be part of her life, claiming he'd cleaned up, claiming he deserved another chance. Maren, cautious but wanting to believe in the possibility for her daughter's sake, allowed a supervised visit. It took less than 3 weeks for the real reason to surface. Colton had found out through mutual acquaintances exactly who Adrian Cole was, and exactly how much Halden Logistics was worth. He hired a lawyer and filed for increased custody, not because he wanted more time with Delphine, but because his attorney had advised him that a custody dispute involving a wealthy new partner in Maren's life could be leveraged into a substantial settlement, framed as the child's standard of living. Maren found out when the papers arrived at her door. She sat at her kitchen table, the same kind of table she'd once done impossible math on, except this time the numbers were replaced by legal terms she didn't understand, and for the first time since the parking lot, she felt the old fear crawl back in whole. "He can't do this," she said when Adrian arrived, papers spread across the table. "He hasn't paid a dime of support in over a year. He's used this as a business opportunity." "He can try," Adrian said, sitting down across from her, "but he's wrong about one thing. He thinks money makes this complicated. It doesn't. It makes it simple because now there's a paper trail on everything and I have people whose entire job is paper trails. I don't want you fighting my ex-husband's lawyers for me. This isn't your fight. Maren." Adrian's voice was quiet but absolutely certain. "The day I met you, you told a napkin dispenser that single mothers don't get happy endings. I've spent the better part of a year trying to prove that sentence wrong, not because I wanted to save you, but because I don't believe it's true, and I refuse to watch a man who abandoned his daughter use greed to prove you right. This is my fight too. Delphine made it my fight the day she called me the coffee man and told her friend I was part of us." Maren's eyes filled. The custody hearing 3 months later did not go the way Colton's lawyer had promised him it would. The court reviewed 5 years of missed support payments, documented visitation absences, a pattern of contact that only ever seemed to resume when Maren's circumstances improved. The judge was not sympathetic to a father who reappeared exactly when there was money nearby to be pursued. Maren retained full custody. Colton's visitation was reduced to supervised, court-monitored sessions, contingent on consistent support payments that were now garnished directly and automatically, so he no longer had the option of disappearing when it was convenient. Outside the courthouse, in the cold, bright light of a February afternoon, Maren stood with Delphine's small hand in hers and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 6 years. "It's over," she said. "No," Adrian said gently, echoing something he didn't know he was echoing, something true in every story like this one. "It's just beginning." A year after that first whispered sentence in a diner, Maren stood in the kitchen of a house, an actual house with a yard that she and Adrian had bought together, with her name on the deed exactly equal to his, because he'd insisted on that before she'd even had to ask, and watched Delphine chase their new dog around the backyard in the last gold light of a Sunday afternoon. Adrian came up beside her, coffee in hand, the same tired eyes from that first diner now carrying something lighter in them. "You okay?" he asked. "I keep waiting for it to fall apart," Maren admitted. "I've been waiting for a year. I don't know how to stop." "You don't have to stop all at once," Adrian said. "You just have to notice every day that it hasn't." She thought about the woman she'd been at that Formica table with $4.30 in her pocket, whispering a sentence to no one because she believed it completely. She thought about how close she'd come to believing it forever. How many women out there right now were whispering the exact same thing to an empty diner, to a napkin dispenser, to a version of themselves in a dark window, convinced nobody was listening. She wasn't going to pretend her story was ordinary. She knew how rare it was that the man in the next booth had money enough to change everything, and she knew with a clarity that had nothing to do with cynicism, that most women whispering that sentence tonight would not get a stranger's card, or a corporate apartment, or a courtroom win against a man who'd finally run out of angles. But she also knew something else now, something she hadn't known at that table, that the sentence itself had been a lie. Not because a rich man happened to overhear her. Because she had never once, in all those impossible months, stopped fighting for her daughter. The stranger hadn't given her a happy ending. He'd just been the first person in a long time, willing to stand next to her while she built one herself. Delphine came running up from the yard, breathless, cheeks red from the cold, and threw her arms around her mother's waist. "Mommy," she said, "are you sad?" Maren knelt down and looked at her daughter's face, so much like her own, so much braver than any 6-year-old should have had to be. "No, baby," she said, and this time when she smiled, her eyes smiled too. "Not anymore. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone who whispered something in the dark and hoped nobody heard, share it with them tonight. Sometimes the ending isn't written by luck. It's written by every person who refused to stop showing up. Subscribe if you believe single mothers deserve to be seen, not just survived. We'll see you in the next story.